Picture this. You are standing in the shadow of the Palatine Hill in Rome. The year is 218 CE, and the very air seems to vibrate with rumors so heavy with dread that even the marble stones beneath your feet appear to tremble. The blazing Mediterranean sun strikes the palaces above you, until their marble facades gleam with painful brilliance, dazzling to the eye. To the casual observer, Rome still looks like the pinnacle of civilization, its temples pristine, its processions grand, its empire vast. But if you listen carefully, you can sense it. Something rotten, festering beneath all that white marble. You can smell it too. The cloying sweetness of imported Arabian perfumes clings to the air, masking but never quite hiding another stench, the metallic tang of spilled wine and something darker, more nauseating, that makes your stomach tighten. It is the smell of corruption and fear. From behind the gilded doors of the imperial residence comes music, not the solemn hymns of Jupiter sung at state ceremonies, but wild rhythms, flutes shrieking, drums pounding in a tempo that quickens the pulse. The kind of music that fogs the mind and beckons listeners toward forbidden thoughts. This is not governance, it is intoxication. A slave rushes past you, his face pale as limestone. He clutches a golden chalice so tightly his knuckles whiten, his eyes darting left and right. He is terrified not just of punishment but of being seen, of being watched, of being reported. For in this palace, whispers can kill. And to whom would such whispers travel? To the emperor himself, or to someone far stranger? A group of Praetorian guards march by. These men, clad in gleaming bronze, are supposed to be the guardians of imperial stability, the disciplined sword arm of the Caesars. Yet their faces are grim, their steps uncertain. One mutters beneath his breath, so quietly you wonder if you imagined it. Abomination. The gods will punish us. And then above the flutes, above the laughter and the chaos comes a voice. It is young, almost boyish, yet commanding with an eerie confidence that sends a chill across your skin. It barks orders in heavily accented Latin. The exact words are swallowed by the cacophony, but the tone carries. This voice does not sound like Rome. It is something alien, unsettling, perhaps even dangerous. This is Rome in its most perilous hour, for the man, no, the boy behind that voice is not yet 15 years old. He is no seasoned general, no senator with decades of service, no heir carefully groomed for rule. He is a Syrian child priest who has somehow seized the greatest throne on earth. His name is Elagabalus, and in his hands, the empire is about to become a theatre of the unthinkable. Even the gods, some whisper, no longer know what to do. But before we understand how Rome could be transformed into this fever dream, how the empire of Augustus and Trajan could be thrown into the hands of an adolescent, we must trace the story back not to the founding of Rome, not to the rise of the Caesars, but to the crumbling twilight of the Severan dynasty. For it was in the cracks of a faltering imperial system that something unprecedented crawled forth. A boy, proclaimed both emperor and god, whose reign would stretch the very limits of Roman imagination. He was officially called Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a name crafted to tether him to the memory of Rome's philosopher king. But that was a fiction, a mask. His true name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, born not in Rome but in the Syrian city of Emesa, around 204 CE, a provincial, an outsider, yet destined to wield the purple, and what a childhood he knew. Imagine the boy in Emesa's streets, where rising above the skyline was not a marble forum or senate house, but the great temple of Elagabalus. Within it lay a black meteorite, worshipped as the incarnation of the Sunday. The temple resounded with chants of priests and the cries of sacred prostitutes. Incense swirled so thick it clung to hair and robes. The smell of blood sacrifices coppery, pungent, was as familiar to him as the smell of bread in a Roman bakery. This was no austere contractual religion like that of Rome, where the gods were honored with proper rites and then expected to keep their distance. In Emesa, worship meant something more dangerous: possession. To honor the sun god was to lose oneself in ecstasy, to let the divine pour into your body until you no longer knew where mortal ended and God began. Boundaries between male and female, sacred and profane, human and divine, dissolved in the frenzy of ritual. This was the world young Varius grew up in, and it left its mark. Later, Roman historians would condemn him as a monster, a pervert, an abomination. But perhaps what terrified them most was not simply what he did, but the fact that he embodied a worldview utterly foreign to Rome, one where fluidity, not rigidity, defined the sacred. At the center of his life stood his mother, Julia Soaemius. She was no ordinary woman. Her ambition burned brighter than 1,000 lamps in the lighthouse of Alexandria. She was the niece of Julia Domna, the famed Syrian empress of Septimius Severus, who had wielded power with elegance and ruthlessness in equal measure. When Julia Domna died, the Severan dynasty was weakened, but the networks of Syrian women she left behind had tasted power, and once tasted, power cannot be forgotten. Julius Oamius was determined that her son would not merely serve the empire, he would rule it. If necessary, she would tear apart Rome's traditions, shatter its illusions, and gamble everything for his throne. That opportunity came swiftly. In 217 CE, the Emperor Caracalla, last strong heir of the Severan dynasty, was assassinated. His killer, Macrinus, seized the throne. But Macrinus was no Severan, no aristocrat, no darling of the people. He was a man elevated by intrigue, brittle in legitimacy, and desperate to keep the army loyal. His error, fatal in hindsight, was to cut the pay of legions stationed in Syria. Roman soldiers, then as now, could endure many hardships, hunger, heat, endless marches, but touch their wages, and patience shattered. In the grumbling camps of Syria, discontent festered like an open wound. Julius Oamius saw her chance and struck with serpent-like precision. The lie she spun was outrageous, scandalous, almost unbelievable. She claimed that her son, Varius Avitus, was none other than the secret bastard of the beloved Caracalla, born of a hidden affair with his own sister. Audacious? Absolutely. Dangerous? Beyond doubt. But in a world where bloodlines meant everything, where legitimacy was woven from ancestry as much as from armies, such a tale was irresistible. And if whispered often enough, repeated in the right ears, it could transform a Syrian boy into Caesar himself. Thus, the stage was set. In the smoky tents of Legio III Gallica, soldiers who had cursed their emperor for low pay now whispered new words. Hail Caesar! Hail Marcus Aurelius Antoninus! Hail Elagabalus! But Rome was not yet prepared for what was coming. Because what Julius Oamius offered her son was not just a throne. She offered him the chance to embody his god, the sun itself, and to force the greatest empire on earth to kneel before him. And Rome, though it did not yet know it, was about to endure a reign unlike any in its history. To understand the boy who would become Rome's most scandalous emperor, we must return to his beginnings, far from the marble columns of the Forum, to a city where the gods themselves seemed to walk among mortals. The place was Emesa, deep in Roman Syria, and the year was around 204 CE. Rome saw this city as a provincial outpost, but for its inhabitants, it was the center of the universe. At its heart loomed the temple of Elagabalus, shrine of a god older than Rome's Jupiter, older even than the myths of Troy that Romans clung to for legitimacy. The god was not represented by a statue or by words carved in stone, but by a black meteorite, said to have fallen from the heavens in an age when men and gods were still entwined. The boy born here was named Varius Avitus Bassianus. To later Romans, that name would be buried beneath layers of political invention. He would be called Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, to evoke the memory of the philosopher-emperor. He would be hailed as Augustus, to tether him to Caesar's divine lineage. And he would become known by another name, whispered in both fear and fascination, Elagabalus, after the god whose temple had dominated his childhood. Imagine him as a child, darting through the temple courtyard, his small hands sticky with incense dust, his ears filled with the cries of worshippers as drums pounded and flutes shrilled. The air smelled of sacrifice, of burning fat and coppery blood. This was his nursery. These rituals, half ecstasy and half terror, were his lullabies. Roman religion was cautious, contractual. Perform the rite, make the offering, and the gods were bound, at least in theory, to grant favor. It was a negotiation, a cold exchange. But in Emesa, worship was nothing so restrained. Here, gods did not stand apart, distant in Olympus. Here, gods could possess. Men and women swayed in trance until their voices were no longer their own. Sacred prostitutes blurred the line between ritual and desire, between divine union and human passion. In this world, boundaries meant little. Male and female, sacred and profane, mortal and divine. These lines dissolved in the smoke of sacrifice. This was the environment that shaped young Varius. Later, Roman historians Cassius Dio, Herodian, the anonymous author of the Historia Augusta, would condemn him for effeminacy, for sacrilege, for madness. But beneath their venom lies something truer and more unsettling. Elagabalus embodied an Eastern vision of the sacred that Rome could neither comprehend nor tolerate. At the center of his world stood his mother, Julia Oamius. She was not merely a caretaker but a woman with a will as sharp as steel. She belonged to the powerful Severan clan, tied by blood to Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. Julia Domna had wielded influence with a subtle hand, hosting philosophers, advising generals, shaping policy behind curtains. She had shown Rome that Syrian women could move the empire's gears, even if they never touched the throne. But Julia Soaemius was different. Where Julia Domna cloaked ambition in grace, Soaemius carried hers openly, blazing. She had seen what proximity to power could give, and she hungered not for the shadows but for the sun itself. She looked at her son, not just as a child, but as destiny incarnate. The boy himself was unusual, even in his youth. Sources describe him as beautiful in a way that unsettled. His movements were graceful, androgynous, almost theatrical. To Roman eyes trained to expect masculine bearing, such fluidity was disorienting. But in Syria, where divinity could blur gender, it was not weakness, it was sacred. Priests of Elagabalus were known to perform in flamboyant robes, mixing the attributes of male and female. To serve the god was to dissolve categories. For Varius, the lines had never existed. By adolescence, he was already serving as a high priest in the great temple. Imagine the scene. A boy of 13 standing before the meteorite, clad in robes embroidered with suns and stars, his face painted with cosmetics in the Eastern style, bracelets glittering at his wrists. Around him, incense smoke curled, chants thundered, and sacred dances swirled until ecstasy blurred into frenzy. For Romans, the idea of an emperor presiding over such rituals would one day seem monstrous. But for the people of Emesa, he was not only their future ruler, he was the living vessel of the sun god. It is here we see the beginnings of the dual identity that would define his reign. Rome would call him emperor, but he would always see himself as priest. One foot in the purple, one in the sanctuary. And when those roles collided, empire itself would tremble. Yet destiny required more than divine favor. It demanded opportunity. That opportunity came in blood. In 217 CE, Emperor Caracalla, last male heir of the Severan dynasty, was murdered on the road near Carrhae. His death left the throne vulnerable. His successor Macrinus was capable but fatally flawed. He was not of noble blood, and his claim was weak. Worse still, he made the one mistake no Roman emperor could afford. He angered the army. By cutting soldiers' pay in Syria, he sowed discontent among the very legions meant to secure his reign. Julia Soaemius saw her chance. In her son, she had both a claim and a symbol. She whispered that he was Caracalla's secret child, born of an affair with Caracalla's own sister. Outrageous? Yes. But Roman politics thrived on outrageous claims, and soldiers were eager to believe when pay and favor were at stake, and behind the rumor lay something more potent: religion. Varius was not just heir by blood, but embodiment of a god. To resist him was not simply to resist a boy, but to resist the sun itself. Thus, the Syrian boy priest became a rallying figure, not merely for a family's ambition, but for an entire vision of Rome's future, one in which East and West, god and man, masculine and feminine, all blurred together. When later Romans spat his name as an insult, calling him mad or depraved, they were not only condemning his deeds, they were condemning the audacity of a child who dared to challenge the boundaries of their world. In Emesa, that challenge seemed natural. In Rome, it would become heresy. And between those two visions of reality, an empire would soon be torn apart. Behind every throne in Rome there was always a shadow. Sometimes that shadow was a general, sometimes a wealthy senator, sometimes a clever freedman. But in the case of Elagabalus, the shadow was his mother, Julia Soaemius, and she was no shadow at all. She was the driving force, the architect, the will that propelled her son from a provincial temple to the Palatine Hill. Julia Soaemius belonged to the most formidable network of women Rome had ever known, the Severan women. Her aunt, Julia Domna, had been the wife of Septimius Severus, the emperor who had clawed his way from North Africa to the throne and founded the Severan dynasty. Julia Domna had not merely accompanied her husband, she had ruled beside him in all but name, travelling with legions, corresponding with philosophers, and managing imperial affairs while her husband waged war. To Rome's astonishment, she turned the title of Augusta into something formidable. When Severus died, Julia Domna's son Caracalla ruled, and though his reign was blood-stained, her influence continued. For years, the Severan women had tasted power. They had seen that the empire could be guided from behind curtains, that whispers at the right moment could shake armies and tilt senates. Power had flowed into their hands, and once grasped, it is not easily released. Julius Oamius inherited this ambition, but amplified it. Where Julia Domna had tempered her influence with subtlety, Oamius possessed a burning hunger for open control. She was no philosopher's hostess, no gentle mediator. She wanted her son not at the edge of power, but at its very core. And unlike so many Roman mothers, who prepared their sons for careers in law or command, Oamius raised hers to be a god. In Emesa, she had the perfect stage. Her family already held hereditary priesthoods in the great temple of Elagabalus. Her son, various, beautiful, otherworldly, effeminate to Roman eyes but radiant to Syrian worshippers, was paraded as the chosen vessel of the Sunday. Oamius encouraged the rituals, the pageantry, the divine aura. She understood what the Romans did not. That charisma wrapped in mystery is as powerful as any sword. But timing was everything. For years, the Severan dynasty had kept Rome steady, but by 217 CE, it stood on the edge of collapse. Caracalla's assassination left a void. His killer, the Praetorian prefect Macrinus, seized the throne. But he was no Severan. He was the first equestrian born outside the senatorial elite to ever don the purple. To the Roman aristocracy, he was an upstart. To the soldiers, he was a bureaucrat. To the gods, he was unchosen. Macrinus tried to steady his position with discipline. But discipline is a dangerous thing when it means denying soldiers what they believe is theirs. He reduced their pay, hoping to restore Rome's strained treasury. It was a pragmatic move. It was also suicidal. A Roman emperor could execute rivals, suppress riots, even tolerate scandals, but to shortchange the legions was to sign his own death warrant. Julia Oamius saw the crack open wide. Her moment had come. She understood that politics was not about truth, it was about belief. And so she spun a story as audacious as it was scandalous. Her son, she whispered, was the secret child of Caracalla. Born of a hidden affair with Caracalla's beloved sister, he carried Severan blood. The brilliance of the lie lay in its very boldness. Who would invent something so outrageous unless it were true? Rome had long lived on scandalous tales, the bastard sons of emperors, the adulterous liaisons of noble women, the whispers that toppled dynasties. In such a climate, truth mattered less than plausibility, and plausibility mattered less than the hunger of the audience to believe. Oamius wrapped her claim in divine legitimacy. Her son was not merely Caracalla's heir, he was also the living embodiment of the sun god Elagabalus. The soldiers of Syria, weary of pay cuts and desperate for a cause, were offered both gold and glory, higher wages, and the chance to fight for a god made flesh. Picture the scene in a Syrian camp of Legio III Gallica. Hardened veterans, their armor dusty from long marches, their patience worn thin by broken promises, gathered around a makeshift platform. Onto that platform stepped Julius Oamius and her son. He was only 14, yet dressed in purple robes stitched with stars, his face painted with Eastern cosmetics, his manner graceful and alien to Roman eyes. To some, he looked like a priestess more than a prince. To others, he looked like destiny. Julia raised her arms and declared that this boy was not only the bastard son of Caracalla, but the chosen vessel of the Sunday. The legions stirred. Some muttered disbelief. Others, remembering Caracalla with genuine affection, nodded. And when the promise of restored wages was whispered, when the drums of the Syrian priests thundered, when the boy himself lifted his voice in ritual chant, the moment tipped. One soldier fell to his knees, then another, and another. Soon, the chant rose like a storm. Hail Caesar! Hail Marcus Aurelius Antoninus! Hail Elagabalus! In that instant, a boy priest became an emperor, and Julia Oamius, watching from the platform, knew she had gambled everything and won. It was the perfect marriage of ambition and opportunity. But ambition is a fire that consumes, and Oamius had not just ignited her son's rise, she had set Rome itself ablaze. For in proclaiming him heir, she had unleashed not only her ambition, but also the gods of Syria upon the empire, and the Romans, for all their conquests, had never faced anything quite like this. When Emperor Macrinus seized the throne in 217 CE, he believed himself clever. He had outmaneuvered Caracalla, orchestrating the emperor's murder during a roadside journey, and claimed the purple in the chaos that followed. Yet from the very beginning, Macrinus's reign bore the marks of fragility. He was no Severan, no scion of noble Roman blood. He was an eques, a knight of provincial origin from Mauritania, risen through the ranks as a legal advisor and administrator. In the eyes of the Senate, he was an upstart. In the eyes of the legions, he was no soldier. Rome was a society obsessed with appearances, and Macrinus possessed none of the trappings of legitimacy. He lacked the bloodline, the charisma, the military record, His only weapon was pragmatism. And pragmatism, when it runs against tradition, rarely inspires loyalty. At first, he tried to placate the soldiers who had elevated him. Caracalla had been reckless with the treasury, granting donatives and increasing pay to secure the army's affection. The empire's coffers groaned under the weight of this generosity. Macrinus, a cautious bureaucrat by training, sought to correct it. He announced reductions to military pay and benefits, hoping to restore financial balance. It was a fatal error. The Roman legions were not accountants. They did not care for fiscal prudence or balanced budgets. What mattered to them was the coin in their hands. Caracalla had been brutal, unstable, and at times monstrous, but he had loved the soldiers, or at least convinced them he did. He fought beside them, called them comrades, showered them with gold. In return, they loved him fiercely. Macrinus offered none of that. He was distant, calculating, stingy. Resentment spread through the ranks like fire through dry reeds. In Syria especially, where the legions had grown accustomed to lavish treatment under Caracalla, discontent simmered dangerously, and it was into this volatile mix that Julia Soaemius poured her poison. She whispered her scandalous tale, that her son Varius was Caracalla's secret child. The audacity of the claim was breathtaking, but audacity has its own power. Soldiers wanted to believe it, and in believing, they found both justification for rebellion and the promise of restored pay. Macrinus, meanwhile, sat in Antioch reading dispatches that grew darker by the day. Reports spoke of muttering soldiers, of desertions, of a boy priest in Emesa hailed not only as Caracalla's son but as the living sun god. At first, he dismissed it as nonsense. Surely hardened veterans would not bow to a painted youth who pranced in priestly robes. Surely the legions of Rome were not so fickle. But as the reports multiplied, incredulity gave way to dread. His informants described scenes that seemed like hallucinations. Soldiers kneeling in ecstasy before a boy who danced to Syrian drums, his voice rising in chants that mixed Latin with languages no Roman understood. They swore that this youth, this Varius, was performing rituals where the line between worship and theatre, between human and divine, disappeared. Macrinus scoffed at first, but beneath the scoffing he felt the ground shifting. He knew Rome well enough to understand. Men fight for pay, but they die for gods. Macrinus did what emperors always do when threatened. He gathered his forces and marched, yet his army marched half-heartedly, their loyalty frayed, their faith in him paper-thin. Discipline cracked under the weight of whispered rumors. In the barracks at night, men argued not about tactics but about destiny. Was not the boy the rightful heir? Was he not blessed by Caracalla's blood and Elagabalus' fire? The more Macrinus railed against superstition, the weaker he seemed, for nothing reveals desperation like a man who mocks what others begin to revere. When battle came, it was no clash of equals. The Syrian legions met Macrinus's forces, but the fight dissolved into chaos. Soldiers defected mid-combat. Standards fell. Whole units crossed over, their loyalty bought not with coin but with frenzy, with the promise of being part of something divine. It was less a battle than a mass conversion. Picture Macrinus on the field, realizing the nightmare unfolding. The praetorians wavering, the legions dissolving, the thunder of drums shaking the air. His enemies surging forward not just as soldiers but as worshippers. Imagine his horror as he grasped that he was not fighting a man but a movement, not a boy but a god incarnate in the eyes of thousands. His disciplined legions, his supposed backbone, were abandoning him in droves. Macrinus fled. He shed his imperial robes, disguising himself as a commoner, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But an emperor cannot outrun destiny. He was captured near Chalcedon, dragged back in humiliation, and executed. His head was sent to Elagabalus, grisly proof that the old order was dead. With that, a 14-year-old from Syria, once dismissed as an eccentric temple boy, became master of the Roman world. But mastery and control are not the same thing. Elagabalus had seized the throne by a strange fusion of ambition, rumor, and ecstasy. He had toppled Macrinus by turning soldiers into worshippers. Yet what begins in frenzy rarely governs in order. And Rome, accustomed to emperors who at least pretended to respect its traditions, now found itself ruled by one who saw himself not as a guardian of the past, but as a vessel of something entirely new. The fall of Macrinus was more than the end of one man's reign. It was the opening of a door through which poured foreign gods, foreign rituals, and ideas so alien that they would shake the very foundations of Roman identity. Julia Soaemius had won. Her son was emperor. But in winning, she had unleashed forces even she could not control. The camp of Legio III Gallica lay restless under the Syrian Sunday. Soldiers muttered in low voices, sharpening blades already dulled by neglect, grumbling about wages cut by an emperor who seemed more clerk than commander. They had marched and bled for Rome, yet the coins in their purses were fewer than the promises in their ears. Resentment simmered like a pot about to boil over. Into this seething discontent stepped a boy. He was 14 years old, draped in purple robes that shimmered with embroidered suns and stars. His face bore cosmetics in the Eastern style, kohl lining his eyes, cheeks touched with rouge. To hardened veterans he looked strange, unsettling, part priest, part actor. Yet there was something magnetic in his presence. At his side stood his mother, Julia Soamius, regal in bearing, her voice sharp enough to slice through the murmurs of the legion. She declared before them that this boy was not just any youth but the secret son of their beloved Caracalla. His blood, she claimed, ran with the lineage of emperors. He was rightful heir to the purple. The soldiers shifted uneasily. The claim was outrageous, but outrageousness carried its own allure. For in Rome, the line between truth and invention was always blurred by necessity. Was it not possible that Caracalla, known for excess and passion, had sired a hidden son? Was it not possible that this boy, beautiful and strange, bore the Severan spark? But Julia was not finished. She pointed to the boy and proclaimed something bolder still. He was not merely Caracalla's son, he was the living embodiment of Elagabalus, the sun god of Emesa. Here, before them, stood not only an heir but a god made flesh. The soldiers, weary of rationed pay, were offered more than money. They were offered meaning, a cause, a god to fight for. Picture the moment. The camp square alive with tension, drums pounding as Syrian priests in dazzling robes struck rhythms that rattled bone. Incense rose in plumes, mingling with the smell of sweat and iron. The boy priest raised his arms, and his voice clear, high, yet commanding rose in chants that wove Latin with the language of the East. The hardened veterans felt something stir in their blood. Some called it madness, others fervor. Perhaps it was both. One soldier knelt, then another, and another. The dam burst. Soon, hundreds of voices roared together. Hail Caesar! Hail Marcus Aurelius Antoninus! Hail Elagabalus! The name they gave him was not even his own. It was the name of his god. By taking it, he was not just emperor, he was deity incarnate. For the Romans, political legitimacy had always been tied to religion. Augustus had claimed divine favor, Vespasian had courted omens, and countless emperors had presented themselves as chosen by the gods. But this was something different. This boy was not chosen by a god, he was the god, at least in the eyes of his followers. In that instant, the soldiers crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They were no longer simply loyal to a Severan heir. They had joined a cult, a movement that blurred the boundaries between politics and divinity. And once faith takes hold, it is stronger than fear, stronger than discipline, stronger even than the bonds of Rome itself. News of this proclamation spread with astonishing speed. Messengers raced from camp to camp, carrying the story of the boy who was both Caesar and sun god. The tale was infectious. Soldiers who had despised Macrinus's stinginess now dreamed of serving a divine emperor who would restore their pay and bathe them in glory. In Antioch, Macrinus read these reports with disbelief. His spies described rituals that defied Roman understanding, men and women dancing in ecstasy, soldiers swearing loyalty not to an emperor but to a god incarnate, a youth whose very appearance unsettled. They claimed he dressed now as a man, now as a woman, now as something in between. They whispered that his ceremonies involved acts so unspeakable that no Roman tongue dared describe them plainly. Macrinus must have shaken his head, convinced his informants were exaggerating. Surely battle-hardened legions could not be seduced by the antics of a painted boy. Surely discipline and order would prevail. But in his heart, he must have felt the creeping dread. For Roman history was full of emperors raised on stranger claims, and the legions, once stirred, were hard to contain. For the soldiers of Syria, this was not rebellion. This was revelation. To them, the boy was more than a pretender, he was a bridge between worlds. He carried the blood of Caracalla and the fire of Elagabalus. He promised both gold and transcendence. How could Macrinus, with his dry decrees and shriveled legitimacy, compete with that? The acclamation of Elagabalus in the Syrian camp was more than the elevation of a new emperor. It was the birth of something Rome had never faced before. A leader who was not merely political but mystical, not merely Caesar but God incarnate. For the veterans kneeling in the dust, shouting until their throats were raw, the choice seemed obvious. Macrinus was a miser, an upstart, a man without destiny. Elagabalus was destiny itself, burning before them in purple and gold. From that moment forward, Rome was no longer an empire of tradition. It had become an empire under experiment, led by a child who believed the gods themselves had chosen him to tear down the old order and replace it with something new. The chant echoed long into the night, "Hail Caesar, hail the sun god." And in those words, the fate of the empire shifted. The Syrian sun beat down mercilessly as two armies drew near each other in 218 CE. On one side stood Macrinus, the emperor who had claimed power through assassination, clad now in his military cloak, and trying desperately to summon authority he had never truly earned. On the other side surged a mass of soldiers and priests, their standards not only bearing the eagle of Rome but also strange emblems of the east sunbursts, crescents, and symbols of the god Elagabalus. At their head was a boy in purple, painted like a temple idol, hailed by thousands as both Caesar and God. Macrinus had long believed that discipline and hierarchy would protect him. Roman armies, after all, had survived civil wars, plagues, and betrayals. But as his legions formed ranks, he could see the doubt in their eyes. These were not soldiers hungry for honor. They were weary men whispering about omens, about Caracalla's avenging son, about the god who had descended in human form. The clash that followed was less battle than conversion. As the first lines met, many of Macrinus's soldiers simply broke, laying down arms or even crossing over to join the enemy. To fight a god was to invite doom. To join one was to guarantee salvation and perhaps richer pay. The Syrian drums pounded, the incense clouds thickened, and Macrinus's disciplined formations dissolved into chaos. The emperor, watching from a rise, must have felt his stomach turn to stone. He had wagered on reason, on loyalty, on the Roman way of order. But against fervor, against ecstasy, these tools were brittle reeds. There were flashes of resistance, units who held firm and fought as Romans always had, shields locked and gladii thrusting. For a moment, Macrinus may have hoped the tide could be stemmed. But then came the desertions, not in ones and twos but in whole cohorts. Standards fell. Centurions shouted themselves hoarse, only to be cut down by their own men. Macrinus fled. Perhaps he thought he could regroup. Perhaps he thought survival would give him a chance to fight another day. But in his flight, he abandoned the one quality emperors could never afford to lose: presence. An emperor who runs is no emperor. Stripping off his imperial regalia, he disguised himself in humble clothing, hoping to vanish into the anonymity of the provinces. The irony was bitter. A man who had spent his life climbing the ladder of Roman administration, now reduced to pretending he was no one. He may have thought of Augustus's careful balance of power, or of Septimius Severus's iron grip on the legions. Compared to them, he was a shadow, and shadows dissolve in the sunday. But fate has a way of finding emperors who flee. Near Chalcedon, he was captured. No heroic last stand, no dignified suicide with loyal companions. Just a broken man dragged back into the light, his disguise torn away. His execution was swift. His head, severed and bloodied, was sent to the boy god as an offering. And so, with the fall of Macrinus, the stage was cleared. A 14-year-old from Emesa, scarcely more than a child, was now ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Yet the manner of his victory mattered as much as the victory itself. This was not a traditional succession, not a battle won through strategy, or a Senate vote ratified by law. It was revelation, a kind of mass possession in which thousands of Roman soldiers believed they were serving not an emperor but a divine being. Macrinus's death was the death of pragmatism, of order, of the old Roman balance between the human and the sacred. When news of Macrinus's fall spread, Rome itself trembled. Senators whispered in marble halls, asking how they were to honor a boy who called himself both Caesar and sun god. Aristocrats debated whether to resist or submit. The Praetorian Guard, guardians of tradition, eyed one another nervously, uncertain whether to treat this new emperor as master or blasphemer. For Julia Soaemias, it was triumph. Her gamble had succeeded beyond imagining. She had taken rumor, dressed it in purple, and used it to topple a sitting emperor. Yet as she looked at her son painted, exalted, lost in the frenzy of chance, did she wonder whether she had created something even she could not control. The world had shifted. A bureaucrat emperor had fallen. In his place stood a child, born aloft not by law or lineage alone but by the fever of soldiers and the fire of a god. Rome was about to learn what it meant to be ruled not just by a man but by an idea, an incarnation, a force that saw itself as greater than Caesar, greater even than Rome. The boy who had been proclaimed emperor in the Syrian desert was now Caesar, in name. But to rule Rome was not merely to win a battle, it was to enter the city, to be accepted by the Senate, the praetorians, and the people themselves. And so began the long procession westward, a journey unlike anything the empire had ever seen. Picture the caravan that wound its way from Emesa through the sun-baked provinces, across the eastern Mediterranean, and north toward the Italian peninsula. It was no ordinary imperial cortege. At its center rolled a golden chariot pulled by 4 white horses, gleaming so brightly under the sun that onlookers shielded their eyes. In it sat Elagabalus himself, sometimes in the toga of a Roman emperor, dignified and solemn, his hair styled in the manner of Augustus, other times in flowing Syrian robes, painted with kohl and rouge, glittering jewelry at his throat and wrists, resembling more a priest or dancer than a soldier. Behind him marched Roman legions, their eagles aloft. But alongside them were Syrian priests in embroidered robes, eunuchs carrying sacred instruments, and even sacred prostitutes drawn from the temple of Emesa, their bodies painted with symbols of the sun god. Courtiers perfumed the air with censers of incense, while musicians played flutes and drums in hypnotic rhythms that made the ground tremble. To Roman eyes, this was no military procession, it was a religious invasion. Imagine the bewilderment of villagers and townsfolk along the route. They had seen emperors pass before, surrounded by legions in iron discipline, banners snapping in the wind, silence broken only by the tramp of boots. But this was different. It was a spectacle of ecstasy. Soldiers danced with priests, drums thundered at midnight, and sacrifices were offered not to Jupiter or Mars, but to a black stone meteorite hauled on a massive cart at the very heart of the caravan. This was the sacred stone of Elagabalus itself, brought from Emesa to Rome as if to remind the empire that its center of gravity was shifting east. The closer the procession drew to Italy, the more rumors outpaced it. Messengers galloped ahead, bearing tales of a painted boy god who kissed his companions in public, who performed rites too scandalous to describe, who dared to mock Jupiter himself by proclaiming the supremacy of an obscure Syrian deity. In Rome, the Senate debated furiously. Some argued for resistance, insisting that the praetorians could be rallied to defend Roman dignity. Others counseled submission, pointing out that the legions had already declared for the boy, and that civil war would destroy what little stability remained. But beneath their political arguments lay a deeper unease. For centuries, Rome had conquered eastward, absorbing the wealth and religions of Asia. Yet always Rome had remained the master, shaping these foreign elements into Roman forms. Now, for the first time, the East was coming to Rome not as a conquered land, but as a conqueror. In the summer of 219 CE, Elagabalus reached the gates of the Eternal City. The air was thick with anticipation. Crowds lined the streets, craning to glimpse the boy who had toppled an emperor and who claimed to be the living Sunday. Some shouted in approval, swept up by the spectacle. Others stood silent, brows furrowed, unable to reconcile what they saw with their idea of what Rome should be. Through the gates rolled the golden chariot, dazzling in the afternoon sunday. Beside it, borne on a massive litter draped in silk and gold, was the black meteorite of Elagabalus, the god himself, transported into the very heart of Rome. This was no mere symbol. This was a statement. Rome's gods were no longer supreme. A foreign god had entered their city, not as a guest but as master. The Senate, forced into ceremony, greeted him with outward respect and inward dread. The praetorians, though uneasy, obeyed. Their loyalty was to whoever wore the purple, and now the purple belonged to this painted boy. The people, dazzled by the spectacle, murmured uncertainly. Some cheered. Others crossed themselves in old superstitious gestures, fearing what this blasphemous union of emperor and god might bring. Within days, Elagabalus made his intentions clear. He announced the marriage of Elagabalus and Minerva, Rome's goddess of wisdom and war. The ceremony was unprecedented, a blending of Syrian and Roman deities that horrified the traditional priesthood. To the boy emperor, it was a symbolic union of East and West, a mystical wedding that would birth a new golden age. To the Romans, it was nothing less than sacrilege, the violation of boundaries that had defined their world for centuries. And this was only the beginning. Construction began almost immediately on a new temple on the Palatine Hill, dedicated not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to Elagabalus. Hammers rang, and chisels echoed, as workers labored to raise a monument to a god most Romans had never heard of. Imagine the whispers in taverns and markets, the mutterings of aristocrats in their villas. The emperor is mad. He dances in the streets like a priest. He wears women's clothing in public. He sacrifices to a rock. And yet, none could deny that he was emperor. He had the legions, the praetorians, and the throne. His power was real, even if it felt unreal. The march to Rome was complete. The city had opened its gates, willingly or not, and accepted a new master. But the cost of that acceptance was a transformation so profound that even those who welcomed him trembled. For Elagabalus had not come to preserve Rome, he had come to remake it in the image of his god. And for a brief, dazzling, dangerous moment, it seemed he might succeed. The summer of 219 CE settled over Rome like a suffocating cloak. The city, already swollen with rumor and spectacle, now lived beneath the shadow of a boy who called himself both emperor and god. Elagabalus, freshly arrived in his golden chariot, had not crept into the capital, he had burst into it, dragging with him a caravan of Syrian priests, sacred dancers, eunuchs, and a black meteorite that he proclaimed to be the very embodiment of his deity. To the Roman people, this was more than shocking. It was disorienting. For centuries, emperors had presented themselves with dignity, draped in the toga, aloof and restrained, the living image of Roman gravitas. But here was something altogether different. Here was a child who laughed in the streets, who touched commoners, who danced in ecstatic rites while flutes and drums rattled the air. He was not merely performing as an emperor, he was possessing the city, bending its rhythms to his own strange music. The first signs of his ambition appeared within days. He declared that the meteorite of Elagabalus, brought from Emesa, would be married to Minerva, goddess of wisdom and war. The ceremony, drenched in incense and music, blended Roman ritual with Syrian frenzy. To his supporters, it was a mystical union of East and West, the promise of a new divine order. To traditional Romans, it was sacrilege. Minerva, virgin goddess of Rome, yoked to a foreign stone. It was not union, it was violation. Yet, Elagabalus was not content with symbolism alone. He ordered the construction of a grand temple on the Palatine Hill, dedicated not to Jupiter, not to Mars, not to any of the gods of Rome's fathers, but to Elagabalus, the sun god of Syria. The clang of hammers echoed across the city, chisels biting into marble, as workers raised columns for a god most Romans had never known. The Palatine, seat of Augustus and of Rome's proud traditions, was being remade into a foreign sanctuary. Picture the shock of the Senate as these edicts unfolded. The Curia, ancient hall of Roman politics, filled with murmurs of disbelief. These were men who had endured tyrants, who had bowed to monsters like Caligula and Domitian, but never had they faced an emperor who seemed determined not just to abuse power but to erase Rome's very essence. Jupiter, greatest of the gods, had been humiliated. The gods of their ancestors were being displaced. To the Senate, it was not merely blasphemy, it was treason against Rome itself. But what could they do? The legions had acclaimed him. The praetorians obeyed him. If reluctantly, the people, dazzled by free distributions and distracted by spectacles, hesitated to resist. And so, Rome held its breath, suspended between horror and fascination. Among the common folk, whispers spread like wildfire. A shopkeeper in the Subura muttered to his neighbor, "Our emperor wears silk gowns like a courtesan." A craftsman explained to his son why the new ceremonies sounded less like worship and more like drunken revels. Mothers crossed themselves when they heard the music from the Palatine at night, fearful of what their children might learn from an emperor who blurred every line between Roman and Syrian, man and woman, mortal and divine. The Praetorian Guard, once the bedrock of imperial power, found themselves muttering in their barracks. They had sworn loyalty to the emperor, yes, but what did loyalty mean when the emperor wore rouge and pearls, when he declared himself the bride of a god, when he commanded them to guard not the dignity of Rome but the excesses of his cult? Each new order strained their patience, each new revelation chipped away at their obedience. And yet, in public, compliance ruled. Senators bowed, generals saluted, citizens applauded. On the surface, Rome seemed to accept its new ruler. But beneath that surface, resentment gathered like storm clouds, heavy and dangerous. For Elagabalus, though, resistance meant nothing. He lived in a different reality. To him, the boundaries Rome clung to were meaningless. Male and female, sacred and profane, emperor and priest, these were illusions, to be shattered by the new light of the sun god. He wore women's clothing not as disguise, but as declaration. He performed ceremonies that mingled marriage with worship, scandal with salvation. He kissed his favorites in public, married men as well as women, and spoke openly of desires Rome dared not name aloud. To many, it seemed insanity. To others, liberation. But to all, it was unprecedented. The city held its breath because it sensed that something fundamental was shifting. For centuries, Rome had survived emperors who were cruel, wasteful, or incompetent. But now the empire faced something stranger still, an emperor who sought not merely to rule but to transform. And no one, senator, soldier, or god, knew what that transformation would cost. Rome had welcomed its new master with curiosity and fear. Now it waited to see what would come next. The question on every lip was whispered but never spoken. By the second year of Elagabalus's reign, Rome itself seemed to breathe uneasily. The city still stood, its temples, baths, and forums thrummed with life, but beneath the familiar rhythms, tension rippled. The empire's most ancient institutions, the Senate, the Guard, even the family household, found themselves reshaped by the whims of a teenager who refused to be bound by tradition. In the Curia, senators sat stiffly on marble benches, their white togas gleaming under the filtered light. The chamber that had once echoed with Cicero's thunderous orations now buzzed with whispers. What outrage today! The emperor had begun interrupting their sessions with sudden religious proclamations. One day, he declared he had received a vision from Elagabalus, that men might marry men with divine blessing. Another day, he announced a festival where women and men would bathe together in public, an idea so scandalous that seasoned senators could hardly meet one another's eyes. When an old senator dared to object, invoking the mos maiorum, the sacred customs of their ancestors, Elagabalus did not have him executed. That would have been too direct, too predictable. Instead, the man was reassigned to govern a remote, desolate province, far from Rome's center. His exile was a warning disguised as administration. Resist, and you will vanish. The whispers spread. Adaptation meant survival. Resistance meant disappearance. And so the Senate, that proud guardian of Roman tradition, bowed its head. Outwardly, it applauded the emperor's visions. Inwardly, it seethed. Yet beyond the Senate, in the teeming streets of the Subura and the crowded markets of the Forum Boarium, ordinary Romans grappled with their own disquiet. Shopkeepers tried to explain to children why their emperor sometimes appeared in silk gowns with jewels at his wrists. Craftsmen muttered about the Syrian priests who paraded through the streets with painted faces and incense. Housewives crossed themselves and warned daughters not to look too long at the palace processions, where the emperor sometimes danced publicly, blurring the line between ruler and courtesan. Still, not all despised him. Among the marginalized, his reign offered something intoxicating. Freedmen whispered that a new order might finally recognize them as more than shadows of their masters. Women, long confined to roles dictated by tradition, saw in the emperor's fluidity a strange sort of permission that power itself might not be fixed in masculine form. And among the city's hidden minorities, who had lived in silence under the weight of Roman moral codes, Elagabalus's openness, scandalous though it was, hinted at a world where even the unspeakable could be spoken. This tension between outrage and possibility charged the air. Rome was not united in hatred of its emperor, nor was it united in admiration. Instead, the city existed in a state of uneasy fascination, half repulsed, half entranced. The Praetorian Guard, however, felt none of that fascination. These were soldiers sworn to defend the emperor, men of discipline and hierarchy. Yet each new proclamation strained their loyalty. They had endured Caligula, Domitian, Commodus, all had been tyrants, but at least they had played the role of Roman men. Elagabalus, in rouge and silk, declaring himself bride of the sun, seemed to mock everything the guard had sworn to uphold. In their barracks, behind closed doors, they muttered, "How long must we endure this? He shames the purple. We serve Rome, not this, boy." Their discipline kept them from open revolt, but cracks widened with every new festival, every new law that blurred what Romans had always considered sacred boundaries. The aristocracy, too, seethed. Old families whose lineages traced back to the Republic, watched as Syrian favorites, chosen for beauty rather than competence, rose to high office. They muttered into their wine cups about the shame of bowing to courtiers with painted eyes and foreign accents. For them, this was not merely blasphemy, it was humiliation. And yet, Elagabalus seemed impervious to the discontent. He reveled in his own creation. In the new temple of Elagabalus on the Palatine, he presided over rites that looked less like worship and more like theatre. Drums pounding, dancers whirling, incense thick enough to choke the air. He blurred every line deliberately, as if daring Rome to resist him. The city whispered, but whispers are dangerous. They gather strength, moving from taverns to markets, from barracks to villas. They grow sharper in the telling. The emperor is mad. He has abandoned Jupiter. He has married men as well as women. He means to abolish Rome's gods. By the end of his second year, Rome no longer simply murmured. It muttered with menace. For in every whisper, in every sigh of outrage or fear, the same question loomed larger. How long could this last? For centuries, Rome had built its identity on a single foundation: masculine virtue. The emperor was not merely ruler, he was expected to embody Roman manhood itself: disciplined, austere, a soldier first, a father to his people. Augustus had carved that image in marble, Trajan had confirmed it with conquest, Marcus Aurelius had sanctified it with philosophy. Even the excesses of emperors like Caligula or Commodus had been framed within masculine power. But Elagabalus shattered that expectation. Ancient sources, dripping with scandalized contempt, tell us he wore women's clothing, painted his face with cosmetics, and demanded to be addressed in feminine terms. Some claim he sought physicians who might transform his body to match the identity he felt within. Whether these stories were exaggerated by hostile chroniclers or rooted in truth, the effect was the same. Rome perceived in him an emperor who rejected the very concept of Roman manhood. Imagine the shock of a senator, used to marble statues of Augustus's stern face, now summoned to court where the emperor appears in shimmering silks, his eyes lined with kohl, pearls gleaming from his ears. He does not stride forward like a general. He glides, like a priestess in a temple dance. For Romans, it was not merely odd, it was destabilizing. If the emperor himself refused to embody masculinity, what did that mean for the order of the world? But Elagabalus did not stop at appearance. He broke boundaries in marriage too. He took wives, yes, but also husbands. He wed men publicly, the most famous being Hierocles, a charioteer whose rugged beauty captivated him. Ancient writers record that Elagabalus called himself Hierocles' wife, even his queen. It was not just private indulgence, it was declared openly, paraded before the court. For Rome, this was unthinkable. A man might indulge in secret affairs, might even take lovers of either sex, but the emperor was supposed to embody dominance, not submission. To speak publicly of being a bride, to delight in being ruled in the bedroom, was to invert the very hierarchy on which Roman society rested. And yet, there was a strange brilliance in it. By refusing the rigid categories of Rome, Elagabalus created something new, an emperor who was not bound by gender at all, who could be man, woman, priest, goddess, god. To some it was blasphemy, to others, liberation. The court became a theatre of this new vision. Ceremonies blurred the sacred and the sensual. Dancers swirled through marble halls. Music thundered. Incense choked the air. Senators, forced to attend, sat stiffly while the emperor in jeweled robes performed rites that looked more like weddings than sacrifices, joining himself not only to mortals but to gods. Each new proclamation seemed designed to unmoor Roman identity further from its foundations. Outside the palace, Rome wrestled with what it saw. In taverns, men cursed the emperor for dishonoring the purple. In whispered corners, others admitted a secret fascination. What if power could truly transcend gender? What if the empire itself could become something more fluid, more expansive than the rigid categories of the past? But whispers of admiration could not protect him from whispers of resentment. The Praetorian Guard gritted their teeth, forced to salute an emperor who declared himself bride, who ordered them to stand watch while he staged marriages that mocked Roman custom. For soldiers trained to see discipline as masculine, to endure humiliation as honor, each of his declarations was an insult carved into their very souls. Elagabalus, however, seemed blind to the danger. Or perhaps he relished it. Perhaps he believed his divine status shielded him. Perhaps he believed that by breaking boundaries of gender and power, he was not destroying Rome but remaking it into a city that mirrored the fluid ecstasies of his god Elagabalus. Yet even a god-emperor must reckon with the mortal world. The Senate could bow and murmur, but it could not forget. The guard could salute, but their patience wore thin. And the people, bewildered by spectacle, began to mutter the most dangerous of questions. If the emperor is no longer Roman, why should Rome obey him? In breaking the boundaries of gender and power, Elagabalus had created a vision unlike anything the empire had ever seen. But visions, no matter how dazzling, carry a price. And the price was coming due. At the heart of Elagabalus's reign lay not the Senate, not the guard, not even the palace, but a stone. A black meteorite, smooth and heavy, said to have fallen from the heavens into the Syrian city of Emesa. To Romans it was a curiosity, perhaps a sacred relic. To Elagabalus, it was everything. His god, his source of power, the very axis of his existence. This stone was no ornament. It was enthroned, clothed in silks, crowned with jewels, and worshipped as the incarnation of Elagabalus, the sun god. Wherever the emperor went, it travelled with him. When he entered Rome in triumph, it rode in procession, towering on a golden cart. The people of the capital forced to watch as their emperor bowed not to Jupiter or Mars but to a block of foreign rock. For Elagabalus, the stone was not merely an idol. It was his husband, his divine counterpart. He staged elaborate ceremonies in which he married the meteorite to Roman goddesses. Minerva, goddess of wisdom and war, was his first chosen bride. Later came Juno, Venus, and others. The rituals were lavish, blending Syrian ecstasy with Roman pomp. Priests danced, drums pounded, incense thickened the air, and the emperor himself presided, sometimes in male robes, sometimes in female attire, always in the thrall of the stone. To Romans, it was incomprehensible. Marriage was a human institution, binding families and bloodlines. To see their emperor wed a rock was madness, or worse, blasphemy. It mocked not only their religion but the very logic of their world. Gods had always been above mortals, aloof, inscrutable. Now a foreign god was paraded through their streets as if Rome itself had been conquered by Syria. And yet, there was a strange spectacle to it, a seduction that some could not resist. Imagine the scene. The Palatine Hill transformed into a sanctuary, its marble halls draped in silks of crimson and gold, the air pulsing with music never before heard in Roman temples. The emperor danced before the stone, his jeweled robes glinting in torchlight, his painted eyes lifted toward the sky. To his followers, it was divine possession. To his enemies, it was insanity. Elagabalus appointed Syrian priests to high offices, replacing traditional Roman pontiffs. These men, some eunuchs, some former slaves, performed rites that scandalized senators. Ecstatic dances, blood sacrifices, whispered chants in languages few in Rome understood. The line between sacred and profane blurred until no one could tell where worship ended and indulgence began. But the emperor went further still. He proclaimed that all other gods of Rome were subordinate to Elagabalus. Jupiter, once king of the gods, was demoted. Mars, Juno, Venus, all were stripped of primacy. Rome itself, the eternal city, was forced to bow before a foreign stone. This was not merely religious reform. It was revolution. Religion in Rome had always been transactional. The gods protected the state, and the state honored the gods. By elevating his own deity above all others, Elagabalus was not just altering ritual, he was rewriting the cosmic order. The reaction was swift and bitter. Senators muttered in private that the emperor had lost his mind. Priests of Jupiter seethed at their humiliation. Citizens whispered in the markets, asking how long Jupiter would tolerate such insults before hurling thunderbolts at the Palatine. And yet, the emperor pressed on, intoxicated by his vision. He ordered the construction of a massive new temple, the Elagabalus, on the Palatine Hill, the very heart of Roman power. Its foundations rose where once Augustus had walked, where tradition was thickest. To Elagabalus, it was destiny, Rome remade as the sanctuary of his god. To the Romans, it was desecration. In this temple, the black stone sat enthroned, surrounded by treasures seized from across the empire. Gold, jewels, silks, even sacred relics of other cults were carried into its chambers, all placed at the feet of Elagabalus. The emperor proclaimed that Rome must recognize one supreme god, and that God was his. The people, bewildered, obeyed outwardly but whispered inwardly. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on absorbing foreign gods, blending them into its pantheon. But never before had a foreign god conquered Rome itself. It was as though the empire, master of the known world, had been spiritually enslaved by a stone. And so, the cult of the Black Stone became the axis of the empire. Every festival, every decree, every vision of the emperor circled back to it. Elagabalus had not come merely to rule, he had come to transform Rome into a temple. And while incense still rose, and music still pounded, while the emperor still danced in jeweled ecstasy, the city below held its breath. For it knew that revolutions born in frenzy rarely end in peace. By the third year of Elagabalus's reign, the capital itself seemed to strain under the weight of contradiction. On the Palatine Hill, the new Elagabalus temple rose higher with each stroke of hammer and chisel, its columns gleaming in the sun, its chambers filled with the heady perfumes of Syria. Priests in jeweled robes chanted in foreign tongues, their ecstatic dances shaking the marble floors of Rome's most sacred ground. But below, in the markets and taverns, the city grumbled. The cult of the Black Stone had gone from curiosity to burden. Citizens whispered that their gods had been insulted too long. Priests of Jupiter muttered in anger at their diminished role. Even the common laborers, once dazzled by the spectacles, grew uneasy. What if Jupiter's thunderbolts truly did fall? What if Rome had doomed itself by bowing to a foreign idol? Resentment thickened like summer air before a storm. In the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, unease grew sharper. These were men sworn to defend the emperor, the mailed fist of imperial authority. Yet each day they were ordered to stand guard not at solemn ceremonies of Roman dignity but at wild Syrian rites. They watched their emperor dance in silks, call himself the bride of a god, and force Rome's mightiest institutions to kneel before a stone. Whispers spread among them like cracks in marble. This is not Roman. We swore loyalty to Caesar, not to this madness. Loyalty could bind soldiers only so long before humiliation snapped it. In the Curia, the Senate smoldered in silence. Senators still bowed, still applauded the emperor's proclamations, but their hearts burned with anger. Families whose ancestors had marched with Scipio or debated with Cicero now found themselves groveling before Syrian priests chosen for beauty rather than wisdom. Every decree that contradicted Roman law, every spectacle that mocked Roman custom, deepened their resolve. Yet open rebellion was dangerous. Elagabalus had spies, and his mother Julia Soamius wielded influence like a dagger in the dark. So, the senators waited. They whispered to one another in coded phrases, shared glances heavy with meaning, and nurtured their anger like a flame hidden from the wind. Even the Roman populace, fickle as the tides, began to sour. At first they had enjoyed the festivals, the free distributions, the wild performances that made the city pulse with strange new life. But novelty wears thin. Bread grew scarcer as funds drained into the emperor's spectacles. Taxes rose. The lavish spending on the Elagabalus temple strained the treasury, and the constant mockery of Roman gods felt less like entertainment and more like provocation. A shopkeeper explained to his son why Jupiter's temple now sat empty while foreign priests sang to a rock. A mother hushed her daughter when she asked why the emperor dressed as a bride. In whispers, they began to call him not emperor, but abomination. Amid this discontent, another Julia moved silently. Julia Mamaea, the emperor's aunt, mother of his cousin Alexander. Where Soamius had bet everything on her son's rise, Mamaea played a longer game. She cultivated the Praetorians with promises of stability. She spoke softly to senators about restoring dignity. She presented her boy Alexander, calm, dutiful, traditionally Roman, as the antidote to chaos. In private gatherings, she whispered of a return to order, of Rome restored to Roman hands. She did not yet act, but she was patient. She knew that revolutions consume themselves, and she meant to be ready when the fire turned inward. And what of the emperor himself? He seemed untouched, perhaps even unaware of the storm gathering around him. Surrounded by flatterers and favorites, he danced on in jeweled ecstasy, convinced that the gods smiled upon him. He spoke of visions, of cosmic unions, of remaking Rome into the center of a new spiritual world. When reports reached him of unrest, he dismissed them. The people do not understand yet, he told his priests, but they will. The sun always burns away the shadows. It was hubris, for the shadows were not fading, they were lengthening. By 221 CE, the cracks were undeniable. The Praetorians muttered openly in their barracks. Senators no longer bothered to hide their contempt. The people grumbled in the streets. Even within his court, favorites jostled for advantage, whispering to rivals, hedging their loyalty. The seeds of betrayal had been planted. They only needed water, and soon they would grow into daggers. Rome had endured tyrants, endured fools, endured monsters. But could it endure a god in silk, a bride of a stone, an emperor who defied every boundary of man, woman, mortal, and divine? The city itself seemed to whisper the answer in every darkened alley, every hushed Senate chamber, every guarded conversation among the guard. Not for much longer. The gods had once whispered to Elagabalus in dreams of golden light, commanding him to reshape Rome in the image of Syria. But now, in the shadowed corridors of the Palatine, the whispers grew darker. They no longer promised glory. They threatened doom. Servants whispered that the emperor no longer slept. He paced marble floors at night, his jeweled robes discarded for a simple cloak, his eyes darting toward corners where no one stood. He claimed he heard footsteps that stopped when he turned, voices speaking in tongues he could not name, shadows that lingered too long before vanishing. What had once been confidence curdled into fear. He doubled the number of guards at his chamber doors, then accused them of spying for Jupiter's priests. He ordered food tasters for every meal, then refused to eat, convinced poison seeped through even the simplest bread. He executed servants for imagined slights, only to pardon them moments later in a haze of regret. The court that had once been a theatre of ecstasy now became a stage of suspicion. Priests who once whirled in dances of devotion now stood in stiff silence, their eyes cast downward. Courtiers who once boasted of the emperor's favor now slipped away, claiming illness or family duty. Even his Syrian advisors began to withdraw, murmuring that the god's voice in the emperor's throat had grown hoarse, uncertain, broken. Julia Soaemius, his mother, tried to hold him steady. She reminded him of his triumph over Macrinus, of the legions who had once knelt at his feet. She urged him to temper his excesses, to recall that an emperor could not rule by fear and spectacle alone. But Elagabalus no longer listened. To him, even his mother's counsel sounded like betrayal. The religious ceremonies grew more elaborate, more desperate, as if each ritual could drown out the whispers. He demanded sacrifices by the dozens, animals slaughtered until the temple floors ran slick with blood. He ordered entire nights of drumming, flutes shrieking until the dawn, his voice hoarse from calling the god to defend him. But the more he demanded, the less divine he seemed. Where once he had appeared radiant with ecstasy, now he appeared haggard, frantic, a boy drowning in shadows. The city noticed. Rome was a city of gossip, and the palace's marble walls could not contain the truth. Rumors spilled into taverns and markets. The emperor is mad. The god has abandoned him. He sees demons in the night. Each retelling grew more dramatic, more damning. Some whispered that Jupiter himself had cursed him. Others claimed Venus punished him for mocking her rites. A few muttered that Rome could not be ruled by a boy who claimed to be bride and priestess, husband and god all at once. The Praetorian Guard heard the rumors, and they believed them. Their loyalty had already frayed, stretched thin by years of humiliation. Now they began to ask themselves a dangerous question. If the emperor no longer carried the god's favor, if even his own priests whispered of his madness, then why should they obey him at all? It was then that Julia Mamaea, patient and calculating, began her quiet ascent. She had waited for the storm to break, and now it was breaking. To the senators she spoke of stability. To the guard, she promised dignity restored. To the people, she held up her son, Alexander, a boy younger than Elagabalus, yet already embodying everything Rome craved. Modesty, piety, Roman restraint. Elagabalus, blinded by paranoia, never saw it coming. He raged at shadows while his aunt stitched together alliances. He dreamt of conspiracies, while the true conspiracy grew in his own palace. He was an emperor surrounded, not by enemies on the battlefield, but by betrayal in whispers, daggers in silence. The sun god's chosen one, once radiant with audacity, now flickered like a candle in the wind. And everyone in Rome, from senator to soldier to slave, could feel it. The end was near. March 222 CE. The Palatine Hill, once echoing with music and incense, now hummed with tension sharp as a drawn blade. Elagabalus still called himself the chosen of the sun, but the light around him had dimmed. His priests no longer danced with conviction. His courtiers whispered of escape. His guards obeyed, but their salutes were mechanical, empty. Rome itself seemed to recoil from him. The breaking point came with a proclamation so audacious it silenced even his most loyal followers. Elagabalus announced his intent to strip every Roman temple, Jupiter's, Mars's, Venus's of their gods. The statues, he declared, would be carried to the Elagabalium, where they would bow before his black stone. It would not merely be Rome's supreme god, it would be Rome's only god. For Romans, this was no longer eccentricity, it was sacrilege. Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, lord of the capital, had never knelt to anyone. Mars, the guardian of Rome's wars, had never been displaced. Now a boy in silks demanded their humiliation before a foreign rock. Even his mother, Julia Soaemius, who had once believed his every claim, grew pale when she heard it. She urged him to wait, to soften, to consider the city's rage. But he would not. The sun god's will, he said, was beyond compromise. The Praetorian Guard, tasked with guarding these proclamations, muttered in fury. Their patience, stretched to breaking, snapped. They had endured his robes, his marriages, his rights, but to see their gods dragged in chains? No soldier of Rome could accept it. Their commanders, long courted by Julia Mamaea, began to meet in secret. They no longer spoke of guarding the emperor. They spoke of saving Rome. Julia Mamaea moved swiftly. She had prepared her son Alexander as a mirror opposite of his cousin. Modest where Elagabalus was extravagant, Roman where he was Syrian, dutiful where he was erratic. When the Praetorians sought an alternative, she offered him. Whispers passed through the barracks. Alexander is the true Caesar. Alexander is Rome's hope. Elagabalus sensed betrayal but could not name it. His paranoia deepened. He dismissed courtiers, replaced guards, demanded sacrifices that drained the treasury. But every act only revealed his desperation. The more he grasped, the more Rome slipped from his fingers. The final act came on a cold March morning. Summoned to meet with the Praetorian commanders, Elagabalus entered the chamber with his mother at his side. He expected deference, perhaps unease, but loyalty still. What he found was silence grim, impenetrable. The commanders did not kneel. Their faces were stone. He demanded obedience. None answered. He promised rewards. None stirred. Only when armed men stepped forward did the truth strike him. The guard had chosen Rome over him. Julia Soaemias threw herself before her son, crying out that he was Caesar, that he was divine, that to strike him was to strike the gods themselves. But the Praetorians no longer feared his divinity. They dragged mother and son from the chamber, down the marble halls where incense still clung to the air. Outside, the palace echoed not with music but with the steel rhythm of soldiers' boots. The boy who had once commanded legions with a glance, who had danced in jeweled ecstasy before Rome, now faced the end. There was no trial, no speech, no last defense. Only swift, merciless execution. Julia Soaemias died first, her ambition extinguished in blood. Elagabalus followed moments later, the self-proclaimed bride of the sun god cut down not by thunderbolts, but by the blades of his own guards. Yet even death was not enough. The Praetorians dragged his body through the streets, stripping it, mocking it, hurling it into the sewers. Finally, it was cast into the Tiber, the same river that had swallowed enemies of Rome for centuries. In that act, the guard declared not merely the end of an emperor, but the erasure of everything he had tried to create. By evening, Alexander Severus was proclaimed emperor. 13 years old, quiet and solemn, he was hailed as the savior of Rome. The Elagabalium was stripped of its treasures. The black stone was shipped back to Syria. Roman gods were restored to their temples. In a single day, the revolution of Elagabalus was undone. But revolutions, even in failure, leave scars. Rome had seen what it had never imagined. An emperor who blurred every boundary, who dared to claim that power itself could transcend gender, tradition, and even the gods. His reign ended in blood, but his audacity could not be forgotten. The sun had set on the boy emperor. Yet the questions he forced Rome to ask, the fragility of tradition, the nature of identity, the meaning of divine power, lingered in the air like smoke after a great fire. The body of Elagabalus vanished beneath the waters of the Tiber, but his shadow lingered over Rome. The senators exhaled with relief, believing the storm had passed. The Praetorian Guard congratulated themselves for restoring order. Julia Mamaea assumed her place beside her son, the new emperor Alexander Severus, determined to erase every trace of her nephew's reign. Temples were cleansed, statues smashed, priests of Elagabal dismissed or executed. The Elagabalium, once crowned with silks and incense, was stripped bare. The black meteorite so recently paraded as the god of gods was quietly sent back to Syria, removed from the city it had once conquered. Rome returned to its rituals, its gods, its traditions, as if the last 4 years had been a fever dream. But history is not so easily silenced. For those who had lived through it, Elagabalus was unforgettable. The senators spoke of him with disgust, preserving in their chronicles an image of depravity, a boy who had mocked manhood, desecrated the gods, and shamed the empire. Later historians, relying on those accounts, would repeat the same refrain: mad, wicked, abomination. His name became a cautionary tale, invoked whenever Rome sought to warn against excess, foreign influence, or moral decay. Yet beneath the condemnations, something more complex remained. Among the marginalized, memories lingered of a different Rome brief, chaotic but revelatory. Slaves recalled an emperor who lifted them to positions of honor, not for their birth but for their beauty or devotion. Women whispered of a ruler who blurred gender itself, who proved that power need not wear a man's face. Followers of foreign gods remembered a moment when their rights were not merely tolerated but exalted in the very heart of the empire. For them, the reign of Elagabalus was not merely scandal, it was possibility. Even the ordinary citizens, though they cursed his excesses, could not erase the spectacle from their minds. They had seen Rome transformed into a stage of ecstasy, its marble streets echoing with Syrian drums, its emperor dancing not as Augustus had once stood solemn, but as a creature half mortal, half divine. Whether they loathed it or secretly longed for it, they had witnessed something that would not fit back neatly into tradition, and so his legacy fractured. To some he was a monster, to others a visionary, to most an enigma. Modern eyes, peering back through the fog of hostile sources, see in Elagabalus perhaps the first ruler in history who dared to challenge openly the rigid categories of identity. Was he mad, or was he, in his own way, truthful to himself in a world that demanded conformity? Was he depraved, or was he simply too far ahead of his time, daring to live possibilities others could not yet imagine? Rome chose to forget him, to bury him in contempt. But history, like the Tiber, sometimes preserves what it tries to wash away. His reign, brief as it was, raised questions Rome could not unask. What is power? What is gender? What is sacred? And who has the authority to decide? Elagabalus's sun had burned too brightly, consuming itself in 4 years of chaos. Yet even as his ashes sank into the river, the glow of his vision haunted the empire he tried to remake. For centuries after, Rome would struggle with the same tensions he embodied: tradition versus transformation, order versus ecstasy, the rigid versus the fluid. The boy who called himself both emperor and bride, both priest and god, had been destroyed. But the questions he forced into Rome's heart survived him and, perhaps, outlived even Rome itself. Standing again in the shadow of the Palatine, where marble whispers still echo, one can almost hear it, the faint, mocking laughter of a boy who once believed he could remake the world. The sun had set, but the light it cast would never be entirely extinguished.